They call him the Hatter. His face is only a rumor. His body is an urban legend. But, his intentions are always clear. Once the invitation arrives, he will be waiting, likely with a knowing smile and lashing tongue. Marcus was an unexceptional man. He worked 8 hours a day in some indistinct office, punching numbers, balancing accounts, and taking phone calls. He kept to himself, preferring to spend his evenings alone, sinking into a good book rather than the revelries of bars and nightclubs. Though he had his eyes set on Janet from accounting, Marcus seldom spoke with her, and their relationship was best described as accidental. Ever a creature of habit, Marcus was a predictable man, always living under an invisibly ticking clock. He would wake up every morning at 6:30 a.m., never sleeping a minute under or over. He would shave, shower, and cook a simple breakfast of faintly buttered rye toast and coffee. 2 slices on his plate, 2 sugars in his coffee, and Marcus was ready to go. He drove to work, clocked in, and stayed in the same place for 8 hours, leaving only to eat lunch or use the bathroom. Sometimes his co-workers would drop in for a casual conversation, but this happened with increasing rarity. He'd drive home, change into his pajamas, and cook a simple meal of meat, potatoes, and some greenery if he felt adventurous. For him, excitement and color came through carrots and peas. Then, at exactly 11 p.m., Marcus went to sleep, never to rise until the next morning. Marcus was boring, and he liked it that way. The Hatter had other plans. After a great day at work, Marcus was ready for new reading material. Perhaps his issue of Reader's Digest had arrived, or perhaps his family had sent him an early Christmas card. He needed some entertainment, and with a brisk walk approached his mailbox. Sure enough, a pile of letters waited for him, and like a vulture with an affinity for milquetoast, Marcus scooped these up, taking great care to conceal his treasures from the pouring rain. Dripping and dashing, he gingerly slammed the door shut, unceremoniously tossing his coat over a nearby chair. Sadly, it seems Marcus would be met with disappointment this evening. Instead of his favorite magazine or warm greetings, he found bills, advertisements, and one pamphlet about his local congressman several months too early. In the hopes that he had missed something, he flipped through the stack again and again, only to be met in vain. Then, he heard the faint swish of a letter landing on the floor. The Hatter was terribly fond of grand gestures, and the invitations to his party are always carefully hidden. Whether hidden with care or in plain sight, he made sure his potential guests always found their letter in time, and Marcus was no exception. He'd been watching Marcus, and he eagerly awaited his response. The letter was small, no larger than a Christmas card. It was addressed to Marcus in clear, elaborate cursive, and the return address was his own house. This is the Hatter's way, for both the destination and the starting point come together in his plans. Perhaps placing the letter back in the mail can drive off his eye. Perhaps it is another of the Hatter's games, silently mocking his prey that there is no escape. Either way, Marcus opened the letter. It offered no resistance, it longed to be opened. Inside, he found a simple card, embroidered with shades of red and gold lettering. He saw the shine of golden script on both sides, and casually turned the invitation over. The reverse side held a date and a time, April 14, 2:31 p.m. Curiously, he glanced at the other side. And there it was, in bold print. "You should sit." This phrase is the Hatter's invitation. It is a simple command, no more threatening than asking to continue breathing. But to follow the instruction is to answer the Hatter's call, and many fall into this gentle trap. Marcus knew no better, and sat down, pondering the strange letter. A single footstep echoed behind him. Perhaps a cup of tea would calm him down. Was he nervous? No, strangely not. He had forgotten his movement to the kitchen, a momentary amnesia as he brewed a steaming pot of Earl Grey. As the moist aroma wafted through the room, he felt an intense relaxation. He could hear a faint bubbling amidst the silence of his home, and with each pop an excitement began to overtake him. Perhaps I have been too hasty, he thought to himself. I hardly give my co-workers the time of day. Advertisement. The gentle flow of hot tea pouring into his mug brought feelings of joyous guilt, and unfamiliar thoughts flew into Marcus' head. I should reach out to them. After all, what harm is a new friend? A silent sip, and a beaming grin crossed his face. In some dark place, the Hatter returned the gesture. The next day, Marcus rose at 6 a.m. He sprung out of bed with an unknown energy. Surely, he had been rejuvenated, and his blood felt hot and bubbly. Such an exceptional blend of Earl Grey, he thought to himself. This morning it was eggs and bacon. He didn't remember buying those, but who was he to argue? At the office, his co-workers found a completely alien Marcus. He went out of his way to ask people how they were doing, hold doors, and tell jokes. Even his boss went along with it, and Marcus became the life of the party. His charm was contagious, and over the course of a month, the stagehand had gone center stage. He knew their names now: Janet, her sister, Clara, Andrew, Gary, and his boss, Everett. Every day, he had another cup of tea, often brewing pots for his co-workers during lulls and paperwork. They had grown to love Marcus, and the Hatter enjoyed the show. He would go out with them, though he cared little for clubs. Instead, he would take his new friends to comedy clubs, or invite them to the local theater. He showed them culture, and for reasons unknown, they loved it. All the while, the burning feeling flowed through his veins. One day, Marcus realized something dire. Despite his new friends, he had never invited them to his home. Even Janet had never seen his home, and no one seemed to notice but him. He knew he had to rectify this. During their lunch break, he proposed a classy gathering of olden times, a tea party. His infectious charm did the work for him, and his friends all agreed to such a lovely gesture. And so, on April 14th at 2:31 p.m., 5 guests stepped through his door, and 6 pairs of footsteps echoed through his home. With grand gestures and an elaborate table set, Marcus greeted them, the smile on his face as broad as always. Ever the gentleman, he offered Janet a seat before all else, and she beamed at how lucky she was. Then, clasping his hands together, he addressed his friends. "You should sit." As they obeyed, they were gone. No longer were they Marcus, nor Janet, nor any of their friends. There was only the Hatter, and he had waited long for this entertainment. Suddenly, Marcus' grin widened to sickening proportions, and the guests followed suit. Janet's sister had come along, and as the guests sat at the dinner table, she placed herself on the dinner table, lying back and sighing. They looked on hungrily, and the Hatter deemed that they should say their prayers before their meal. Then, their forks and knives dug into her, severing raw flesh and spurting blood. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. Their gory meal continued, and it devolved into frenzy, with guests forsaking their utensils and biting at her. They shredded her like wild animals, bits of flesh and blood caking to their fine dress and teeth. As she was devoured, they all smiled, including the eviscerated remnants of her sister, an unnatural force keeping her alive until the Hatter deemed she had suffered enough, her mind trapped helpless and silently screaming within her own body. "You may die now." As she had her moment to scream, Marcus bit down on her throat, her shriek devolved into a gurgle. Janet scooped up a severed finger, placing it in her mouth. With inhuman strength, she chewed and swallowed, stifling a giggle. Clara's face inhumanely twisted back into a grin, cracking bone and holding far too wide. She was the Hatter's now. Yet the Hatter's party was far from over, and the guests were ready for his party games. While Marcus escorted their boss into the kitchen, Janet pounced on Gary, her hands on his throat. She viciously slammed his skull on the floor, holding him down, though they all knew it was too late already. His face straining, Janet slowly eased a fork in each of his eyes, gore and white slime oozing and pouring down his cheeks. All the while, Andrew observed, clapping his hands excitedly. Marcus offered his boss a cup of tea, still stuffed and dripping with the blood of Janet's sister. Against his will, he smiled. That would be ever so lovely. His consciousness clawed and scraped inside his skull. "Please God, let me go. Let me out. Help me." His screams echoed inside, but not a sound could escape, a prisoner in his own mind. Perhaps Marcus could hear his plight, perhaps not. Either way, he set the kettle on the oven, and switched the burner on. As blue flames lapped the "No, no, please don't do this" teapot, Marcus reached for his meat cleaver. As man who regularly dined on "Just let me go please" and potatoes nightly, his tools for carving flesh were remarkably advanced. Unfortunately for Everett, their usage today would not be for beef or chicken. As the kettle came to a boil, Marcus smiled. He raised the pot above his head, and Andrew's cheering and applause could be heard in the other room. "Your tea's ready," exclaimed Marcus as he poured the boiling water over Everett's head, searing and peeling away flesh and hair. Amused, the Hatter released him, and his screams came free just in time for Marcus' cleaver to strike his chest. The Hatter forced his blow to strike true and strong, and Everett's heart beat for the last time. But time was wasting, and Marcus got returned to his task of severing his former boss' limbs. Advertisement. Upstairs, Andrew and Janet had made their way to Marcus' bathroom, all the while dragging Gary's body. Andrew's fate, deemed the Hatter, would be the most merciful. Andrew began to fill the tub, water sloshing and splashing. He decided that icy cold would be best, and please don't they didn't do anything more. Hot water was far from original. All the while, Janet gnawed at Gary's neck, her dark appetite not yet sated from her sister. From below, Marcus shouted up. "Janet? Are you almost done up there?" She cupped her hands, glancing out into the hall. "Yes, I shouldn't be more than a minute." Her internal screams had broken down into uncontrollable sobbing, and she begged for someone to save her. Only the Hatter heard. With the tub full of frigid water, Andrew smiled externally. He knew his fate, and "Look away, for God's sakes, look away." Their terrible host was not yet satisfied. Andrew plunged his head beneath the icy water, and the Hatter released him just in time for Janet's hands to force him further in, pressing his face against the bathtub's surface. Arctic waters rushed into his lungs, and each painful gasp only brought more flowing in. Violent bubbles danced to the water's surface, and Janet's lips ran red with ruby droplets. Andrew's screams were little more than a humming whisper, and he heard "Don't do it please," the same whispering command that had damned Clara. "You may die now." His crumpled body draped into the tub, Janet left the two bodies behind, making her way downstairs. Marcus was waiting, holding the same teapot he seared Everett's flesh with only minutes before. She smiled, giving a curtsy. "Oh, Marcus, this was such a lovely party." He just kept beaming, raising the pot high before striking Janet's head with it. She fell to the ground, and Marcus loomed over her. He hit her again and again until the pot could take no more. "Cast iron, for God's sakes," someone helped, crumpling from the repeated impacts. A terrible strength poured through Marcus. Leaning down, he kissed what remained of Janet's head gently. And then, the Hatter released him. Regaining control of his body, Marcus gripped Janet's hands, holding them one last time. He collapsed into quiet sobs, praying to no one in particular for this to just be some awful dream. He wanted to wake up at 6:30 a.m., sit 8 hours in his cubicle, and know none of them. He just wanted them to be safe again. Then, Marcus felt a hand slowly rest on his shoulder, and the Hatter's invitation came again. Like the original letter, it could come from anywhere, and it will always find a way to reach the intended recipient, such as this story. You should sit. Credit to M.L. Zane Bit. Credit to M.L. Zane Bit. I froze, my feet became glued to the frost-covered ground. My chest tightened in fear and anxiety. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, my pulse could be felt in my fingertips. The sound of my blood rushing in my ears drowned out every other sound. It was so loud I could hear nothing else. I willed myself to calm. With great effort, began to slow my breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. While it still came in shallow bursts, but it was easier now, and my burning lungs began to no longer reject the cool autumn air. The crack of a stick broke me out of my attempt of calm. My pulse began to race again as the fear and adrenaline began to spike. I pushed my stiff legs back into movement. Don't stop. I screamed internally. If I stopped, I would be done. I would die. I ran deeper into the forest, surrounding myself with the burning reds and oranges. The trees appeared to be on fire in the pre-sunset light. I could hear his footsteps begin to pick up speed. Mine began to slow in response. No, this could not be happening, not when I was so close to escaping fate. If I don't keep going, nothing would save me. Push. I screamed at myself. As his footsteps become louder, I pick up speed in response. I hear him even more clearly. He must be close. I stop and hide behind a large gnarled oak tree, my back pressed into the gritty bark. I tried to cover myself behind the changing leaves of a partially broken branch. I hear him come to a stop and I stifle the sound of my breathing. He is so close. Then I see him come around the side of the tree, walking to the clearing. His face was flushed and primal and his breath was as heavy as mine. How did such a portly man give such a chase in this mulcted terrain? Advertisement. He was so close to my hiding spot I can feel his rancid breath. I pounced on him, grabbing him. Finally I slit his throat and removed his tracking device. Then I smiled. I was safe. No one would know about me. I began to hum as I headed home to my cottage in the woods. I love the thrill of the hunt. Credit to Ariana. The door slams behind Monica as she stumbles into the hallway of an apartment complex, mascara streaming down her face. Asshole, she says. The word hisses out between her clenched teeth. Fiona steps out of the apartment. Through the open door, Monica hears a snatch of conversation. What's up with your friend? The drummer asks. I don't know, PMS. Katie says. They laugh. Katie, Becca, and Serena laugh like they weren't her best friends only minutes ago. They laugh to look cool in front of Adrian's band, smoking cigarettes and drinking booze she bought them, wearing the expensive clothes and jewelry she loaned them. Assholes, she repeats, fresh tears ruining her carefully applied makeup. Fiona shuts the door behind her. They're jerks, she says. Forget about them. I can't believe Casey would do that to me. She knows I like Adrian. Stupid whore. She probably got caught up in the moment and didn't know how to turn him down, Fiona says. But Monica isn't interested in sympathizing. She wants to rush back into the apartment, bust down the door to Adrian's room, claw at Casey's face, drag her out of the building naked, and let the bums have their way with her. Come on, let's get out of here, Fiona says, guiding her down the hallway, past graffiti, heels catching on the stained, threadbare carpet. They lean against each other for support, walking in a jagged line. Monica curses that last drink. Her brain is ice in a blender, gray matter spinning and pulverizing against the spiny blades at the base of her head. The flickering, murky lighting isn't helping. Beside her, Fiona takes deep, steadying breaths. She doesn't look so hot either. Just beneath the sizzle of dying bulbs overhead, a buzzing nags at her ear. Only when they've reached the bottom floor does Monica realize the sound is coming from her purse. Shit. It's my dad, she says, fiddling with a crystal-studded phone. Are you crazy? Don't answer that. We're screwed if he finds out where we are. I'll just text him. I'll say I don't want to answer because I'm on the can. Is he at home? No. My parents are out of town at PR seminars. As usual. It's fine, he was just checking up on me. That's a first. The frozen air hits them at the same time as they lurch out the door and onto the street. It's because of the San Gabriel stalker, Monica snorts. Dad thinks anything that gets publicity is worth caring about. The San Gabriel stalker was the big word on campus at Lakewood Prep. Everyone tittered endlessly about the serial killer, excited by the sudden media frenzy that had burst their manicured, suburban bubble. Monica had tried to keep the news out of her house. But her dad didn't just have a finger to the media's pulse, he tapped into the vein like a junkie. Just as she'd expected, a sudden outburst of fatherly protectiveness almost convinced him to cancel his business trip. Monica's patience for a few nights to herself, her friends, boys, booze, and anything else she could get her hands on, had run dry. She convinced the old patriarch that he was worrying over nothing, Her mom helped out with a reminder that he was supposed to be making important connections at the conference in New York while she worked the conference in Los Angeles. Monica breathed a sigh of relief when they were whisked away by matching Bentleys. Costumed kid killers were the least of her concerns. She only had a couple of hours to get ready, and she still had to find an older man in desperate need of attention from a young girl, in other words, any old man to buy her alcohol. Anyway, the guy had only knocked off a handful of girls from the Christian Academy on San Gabriel. Nobody she, or anyone in her circle, knew. But out on the dim city street in front of Adrian's apartment complex, police sirens screaming in the distance, trash clogging the gutters, a visual of the killer processes like a Polaroid in Monica's imagination. They should find the car and get home. Screw the other girls. If they don't have money for a taxi, it's their own damned fault. This place is seriously creepy, says Fiona. The girls huddle closer as they walk down the street. They should have brought jackets and a change of shoes, Monica thinks as their sky-high heels smack against the pavement. They're loud against a charcoal backdrop of grungy buildings and streets. Their colorful party dresses snap at a chilling breeze as they hurry along. Monica tries to soften her step, but her legs are so heavy even balancing is tricky. The streets are empty except for a few drifters rubbing the cold night off their hands over garbage fires. They stare at the two stumbling girls on the opposite sidewalk. Monica doesn't make eye contact. Fiona's heart beats faster against her arm. Monica. Fiona draws out the A in Monica's name until it thins into a Y. I think we're being followed, she whispers. Her voice is so soft and tremulous Monica almost doesn't understand. And then she hears them. Footsteps not far behind, dogging their path. The girls speed up, but they keep tripping over their own feet and Monica is having a hard time catching her breath. Her stomach pitches. I think I'm going to be sick, she says. Shit. Where's the car? I don't know. Is this where we parked? I'm not sure. Jesus, I can't remember. Fiona is blubbering so Monica tries to be the calm one. She ignores the churning in her stomach and looks around, still walking as fast as she can, certain she can feel someone's breath on her neck, the heat of an outstretched hand. There's a door on the side of a building only a few steps away. They can bang on the apartment doors until someone lets them in. Monica can call a cab and be in her pajamas watching Cheers reruns before midnight. Maybe she'll make herself a hot cocoa to chase all memory of this night. Come on. In there, she says to Fiona. They break into a tangled almost run through the door and tear up the steps as someone shouts behind them, wait. The girls scream and keep running, not wanting to look back. But the stairwell ends at another door. Monica twists the knob. It doesn't give. She pulls at it with what strength she can muster, but no luck. Fiona joins her, fingers scrabbling at Monica's. Angels of mercy. Monica and Fiona hug each other and flinch as an old homeless man joins them on the platform, dropping to his knees. I know who you are, he shouts. You have come to bring about the end times. I beg of you, save my soul. Let me stand beside God's throne and pray for humanity boiling in torment below. Save my soul. Their shoulders drop. A broken fever pushes small beads of sweat to the surface of Monica's skin. She leans against the door and lets relief wash over her. You scared us half to death, Fiona shouts at the old man. Monica turns to her friend. Fiona looks like crap. What the hell was in those drinks? Holy shit, Fiona. I think we've been roofied, she slurs. Something like cannon fire rocks the stairwell. A moist explosion sprays across Monica's face. The homeless man face plants with a wet thud. Fiona's shrieks echo in Monica's ears. Another man stands at the foot of the steps, holding a gun. A black latex mask with rough holes for the mouth and eyes hides his face. A pair of plastic Halloween demon horns crowns his head. Monica drops to the floor. Fiona is still shrieking when the masked man reaches the platform and grabs her by the dress straps. He wheels her around, but Fiona struggles and manages to free herself. Her heels scrape against the granite floor as she shuffles backward, putting a hand out to push the man away. Monica sees it coming before Fiona does. One of Fiona's heels latches onto the ledge of a step. She rests all of her weight on the back of that foot to lean away from the man. She reaches out again and pushes off on his chest. Fiona's body and the stairs are at an angle. It becomes more acute with each slowly passing fraction of a second. Fiona locks eyes with Monica, who bears witness to the full evolution of her friend's realization before she hurtles headlong down the stairs. Monica hears a crunch and a groan the first time the body hits the steps. She presses her palms against her ears for the rest. While her eyes are closed, as she feels the wind knocked out of her, Monica tries to force sense out of the moment. She reels back in time to protect herself from the ugly, immediate future and stops on a memory. Standing on the corner of Evergreen and Carroll Street, Adrian had asked her to come over that night. He wanted her to hear the band, tell him what she thought. Monica had been waiting for this moment. He wanted her, she knew it. He'd been hesitant about getting close to a high school girl, but she was a senior and freshly 18. She agreed to stop by. He told her to bring her girlfriends along. Monica walked home in a heat, fretting over what to wear, wondering how the night would go. Imagining her first time. The other girls thought she was a pro, but she always chickened out at the last minute. It would be different with Adrian. She let him. Wandering down Evergreen, past San Gabriel and flocks of girls with gold crosses hanging from their necks, Monica clutched her books to her chest and daydreamed. Monica looks up at the killer. He saw her then, mingling with the academy students, clutching her books like a naive schoolgirl. He thinks she's one of them. Wait, I'm not. A sharp, warm sensation floods Monica's chest. She gasps, surprised, but instead of air, she's taking in water. She coughs up. Monica's eyes bulge as she stares at the splattered blood. More sputters out of her throat as spasms rip through her ribcage. Her arms give out and she meets the freezing floor. Monica's head rolls to face the ceiling, to look up at the San Gabriel stalker. But she can only see dark shadows swimming above her head, and pale light reflected off a blade raised high like a sickle moon. Credit to, this is a Final Hours vignette excerpted from dark graphic novel Beatrice is Dead, a coming-of-age story set in the afterlife, written by S. Zainab Williams and illustrated by Robert Burrows. Beatrice is Dead at Facebook. If you enjoyed this excerpt, check out the Beatrice is Dead Kickstarter, ending late October 21st. So hurry if you want to contribute. Please wait. Post views, 2,459. January 7, 2007. I have recently discovered the story of a haunting in an old house. A poltergeist, it would seem. My fellow paranormal hunter associates were discussing the matter at lunch, saying how walkers-by and neighbors heard muffled screams and growls coming the house, even though it has been abandoned for 4 years. I naturally took interest in this ghastly going-on and asked the whereabouts of this haunted establishment. My friend said it was in Liverpool, an old house by a bunch of newsagents and smallish homes. I pondered the skeptic explanations for the stated paranormal events, and the ghostly. I shall do some digging about this house tomorrow. January 8, 2007. The fair amount of information I found strongly points to ghostly explanation of this manor. I managed to find out it used to belong to a once wealthy man, who once ran a popular and successful business. Mr. Walter W. Parkerson. WWP for short. He married his beautiful wife, Mary. They bought the house after Walter's phone shop opened, and 2 months later had a baby girl. However, when this girl reached 2, Mary left Walter, due to his rather unhinged personality. Walter was an angry man, and snapped whenever something went wrong. He was a loose cannon, bursting in a frenzied rage, unpredictable, scary, sometimes. Mary didn't want to live a life like this, and left him with her child. Walter tried his best to look after his daughter, but also tried to commit suicide multiple times. He became very unsociable and bitter, and eventually, he died of unknown causes. Muffled growls and screams coming from this house suggest the trapped soul of WWP, and I intend to explore the house in a couple of days. First, however, I am to see his daughter, Jenny, tomorrow. January 9, 2007. I found out a lot more about WWP today, and went to Jenny's house and discussed her troubled childhood. She is a fine-looking young lady, long sandy hair, healthy body, and a pretty pale face. She seemed very nervous when discussing her father. "Hello," I had greeted. "Please, take a seat." Thank you." She smiled, sitting as she did so. "I hear you grew up in the house that has become a paranormal phenomenon?" "Why, yes, actually. You lived with your father, after your mother left. May I ask how that felt?" "He was a lost soul, tragic really. He loved me, and my mom, deep down he did, but he had a hard time showing it. Ever since my mom left he slowly went angrier and scarier every day, to the point where whenever he walked past I would flinch." She was pulling a half-smile now. "It also says on the newspaper reports that your father tried to commit." I found it awkward to discuss this in front of her. "Suicide?" I gulped. "Yes, 3 times actually. It was terrible. The first time tried to use chemicals, but opposed to killing him, it caused him great suffering. It nearly blinded him, and caused his skin to turn into a sickly green color. The second was drug overdose, which, as you could probably deduce, also failed. It ruined his vocal cords and caused his voice to be deep and throaty, blackening his lungs, and his heart. The third was hanging. He would have finished off the job too if I hadn't stopped him in time. It severely injured his neck, bounding him to his bed, shouting out his demands, and would only come out if clutching his cane, stomping and clacking his way downstairs. That must have been terrible," I added. "It was. Every day he slowly turned more and more into a monster. My friends called him the Big Bad Dad, and I had to agree with them. He was barely human anymore, more like a living, walking corpse. I would always try and sneak out the front door to meet friends and actually enjoy my life, instead of caring for my monstrous father, but he always heard me. He drew. What are you doing?" I scrambled the key into the lock, desperately turning and twisting it. "I'll get you for this, wretched girl." My panic would be unimaginable, as I heard his clacking and clumping downstairs, calling down his threats, and when he finally came down he would. She was fighting back tears, hands clenched, head turned. She rubbed a big scar on her arm, and I knew that sentence needn't be finished. "It's okay. It's okay. Thank you so much for all your help." I smiled hopefully. "You're welcome." She then tried to change the subject. "I'm going on a date with my boyfriend tomorrow." "How lovely. I'm sure whoever he is a very lucky man." She smiled. She showed me out and I ran over my notes. This story was getting deeper and more scary and exciting for the minute. I am to stay at the house tomorrow for the night, and monitor activity. If WWP does haunt his house or not, I'll know. Advertisement. January 10, 2007. As I am writing this, I am observing the house in front of me. It was large and dusty, and made up of red, fading, and crumbling bricks. It has a long, pointing tower at the top, but it is not that high. It has curved, dirty windows, 3 of them, all boarded up with rusted metal and planks of wood. A truly fascinating home. I am to step inside now. As I stepped inside, the door creaked and dust consumed my sight. The corridor is narrow and the wallpaper is pale and peeled. To my right is a twisted, broken staircase. The house is dark, but not too dark, and a flashlight would fix everything. I shall explore now. I have examined the whole bottom floor, and it is like a whole scavenger hunt of stories. In the kitchen are smashed and foul-smelling vials, which most likely held the chemicals that WWP had acquired. The cupboards were open and layered with dust. Cobwebs and rats resided in it like parasites on human flesh. The surfaces were grimy and greasy, and the table was one featherweight away from falling apart into splinters. In the living room there was a dangling, twisted rope, the one that failed to kill WWP. The armchairs are beaten and battered, and the small television is smashed beyond repair. In the front room, there was nothing except an old pill bottle, and a dead rat, which had presumably met its fate eating the remaining pills. I shall explore upstairs now. Oh my God. Oh my good God. My imagination is either overactive, or this house is indeed haunted. As I reached the top of the stairs, I turned round to look in the first of the 3 rooms, and just for a second, I saw a figure, illuminated by a dangling, dim light bulb above. Brief, as its appearance may have been, it matched the description of WWP greatly. It had revolting, decaying green skin. It looked like a hellish mixture of dark green watercolors and vomit. It had, from what I can remember, twisted glasses and broken lenses, but no eyes to speak of. If anything, although this is a crude example, like Dr. Bunsen Honeydew out the Muppets. But sickly and deathlike. My heart is thudding in my chest, my breath fast and desperate. I shall see it again, I must. I walk into the room farthest to my left, and there is nothing except a boarded-up window, a badly lit light bulb and a phone. The phone itself is covered in dust. I will walk towards it to get a better. What was that? I heard a creak of the floor come from outside. My heart is beating faster, whether out of excitement or fear, I do not know. I walk slowly to the edge of the door. I shall look now. Shit. He was there. He was right fucking there. He was walking slowly towards the room in the corridor. I got a better glimpse of him this time. He was wearing a purplish, blackish robe. I have leapt into the corner of this room, shaking and trembling as I write this. I hear another creak. Oh no, oh no. My God, he is walking in. I should be screaming and running, but I am frozen, struggling to breath. He is walking in towards me, no fear of me at all. He's raising a hand now, towards the light. I can barely write this. Oh God. I need to survive. People need to know. Crap. He's just busted the light. It's complete darkness except his outline now, and a strange glue glow is forming by his hand. He's staring right at me. I can't write. My writing is all jumbled. I cannot see my paper. I can't see him. What's happening? He's breathing in my face. God, his breath is terrible. It's a foul stench of decay and emerald. What? My eyes are drooping. I'm falling asleep. I can't write much longer. He's going towards the phone now. He's putting his hand on the phone, the blue electricity forming around it. Oh God. The phone's working again now. What's he going to do with that phone? His fingers are dialing. He's ringing someone. Who is he ringing? I can hear a muffled hello from the phone. I can't write. I can't. So you're making out with her, honey, Jenny, and the phone rings. You answer it, and the voice is, what are you doing with my daughter? Advertisement. Credit to, you can't handle the username. Credit to, you can't handle the username. I've noticed a spot forming on the dining area wall in my apartment. I figure I should call someone about it. But I'll have to worry about it later. I gotta concentrate on the workload I have waiting for me back at the office. I don't have time to call and make appointments about some weird black spot. My workday is as busy as I figured it would be. There's just a lot to get done with my deadline creeping up at the beginning of next week. At lunch I mentioned that spot on my wall to one of my coworkers. He told me that a mixture of water and bleach should clear it right up. If I can get home and clear that up tonight, that would be one issue off my mind. I'll try to remember that water and bleach thing when I get home. Finally made it home. I had to stay late to complete phase 1 of my workload so I can stay on schedule. Time to try that mixture on my wall, though I'm not too clear on how much bleach to use. As long as that spot goes away, I think I'll be fine. I guess I'll just use an old kitchen rag to clean that spot before I cook myself some dinner and go to bed. Another day, another dollar. Good news, that spot is gone, but I have noticed a weird smell. Maybe I use too much bleach, I dunno. The smell should be gone by the time I get home. Time for some scrambled eggs, toast and coffee and see what's on the news. Bad news, it seems that there's another missing person with no clues at this point. I guess I'll keep an eye out. Work was just another rat race for this guy. All this work will make the cheese taste all that much better. I hope I get finished this Friday so I can enjoy a stress-free weekend. Okay, there's definitely something wrong with that mixture I used cause that smell is still here. I'll give it another day, but if it doesn't get any better I'll definitely have to call someone. In the meantime, I'd better get some rest. Well, it's the next day and I think that smell is still sorta here. Maybe I'm used to it. Well, no time for that now. I think I'll be able to finish my workload and get ready for an awesome weekend. I'll just go ahead and make a few phone calls during lunch to get someone over to my apartment to inspect my wall and that smell. Advertisement. Okay, I scheduled someone to come over Friday afternoon, tomorrow, to inspect my wall. I'll be able to finish my job assignment in the morning and I at least have a good reason to get off work a little early. Sounds pretty good to me. Sounds like I'll just have to spend one more night in a smelly apartment before I can let loose this weekend. My assignment is pretty much in the bag so I think I'll get off work a few minutes early to try and beat the traffic and get some well-deserved rest. I decided to pick up some dinner on my way home from work so I don't have to cook in that smelly kitchen. I think I'll eat in my bedroom tonight with the door closed and seal it up the best I can. As I walk into my apartment, that smell hits me in the face causing me to cough and gag. Thinking fast I open a few windows and crank up my AC to air out my apartment. Once I feel like I can breathe again, I venture into the dining area. That spot is back and bigger than ever. It also appears to be leaking some sort of dark fluid. As I get closer I have to shield my nose and mouth from the thick odor with my coat sleeve. Oh God, I can still sort of taste it. My mouth begins to salivate in preparation for any vomiting that I may do. Forget waiting until tomorrow, I need someone to take care of this now. As I inch my way closer I call up the maintenance person I had scheduled. After a few rings he answers and I quickly tell him the problem I had has gotten worse and can't wait till tomorrow. I give him a quick rundown and he assures me that he's only a short drive away and he'll be around in a few minutes. I hang up and at this point I'm right next to the wall and my eyes begin to water. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. As I stare at the spot with squinting tear-filled eyes I notice something. Something small and white poking out of the black spot. With my free hand I grab a napkin off the table and wipe the small protrusion. As I do some of the black spot around the area falls away. Startled I step back and notice the napkin has been stained red. I look back at the newly formed hole on the black spot. At this point I have a gut-wrenching realization. That sharp, white protrusion. Is that a broken piece of bone? With my mind overcome with shock and dumb curiosity, I nudge at the hole with my foot. As the rest of the black spot begins to crumble away my mind flashes with thoughts. I've noticed a spot. Worry about it later. A lot to get done. Water and bleach. Spot gone. Smell. Bad news it seems. Another missing person. Rat race. Smell. Finish my work. Make phone calls. Another missing. Smell. Finish job assignment tomorrow. Another. No clues. Smell. Pick up some dinner. Smell. Spot. No clues. Missing. I wake up to the sound of my door buzzer ringing in my head. As my memory begins to flood back, I scramble to my feet and answer the door. It's repairman I called. I'm rambling trying to explain what happened. The only clear words I think I was able to blurt out were, police, in the wall, missing persons, black spot. As I gesture to the wall my eyes lock onto the small heap of rotten body parts on the floor and everything goes black again. Okay, it's been a couple days. My weekend was hell. I had to spend it away from my apartment which is now a crime scene and I was bombarded with a lot of questions. After everything settled down I was able to find out that one of my neighbors had been abducting people in the area. It's unclear when and how he would kill them, but once he did, he would eat his victims. Advertisement. The body count is unknown, but it seems that he's recently become a bit picky with the cuts of flesh that he would eat. That's why missing person reports have gone up in my area lately. I mean, he would abduct a person, take the certain flesh he wanted and dispose of the rest. Figuring he can't flush or trash his leftovers, he decided the next best thing would be to hide his scraps in the walls. My stomach turns just thinking about it. After getting those details, I was given more bad news. Once they figured out which apartment the remains were coming from, they found that the tenant had already vacated. The name and info attached to the apartment belongs to a dead man. With no more clues and no leads to go on, he remains at large. As much as I don't want to stay in my apartment, I guess I have no choice. Now that the police know he's been here, they'll be keeping a lookout, and so will I. As for the rest of you, who live in apartments, keep an eye on any weird spots on your walls and sleep tight. Credit to Creepy Jonas. I can't sleep. I have to share because maybe I won't feel if I share. Dr. Kirsch says to write and get it off my chest. Writing about it might release me from it. What should I title this? Therapy? I'm currently seated at a computer terminal in a little, white, sterile room. There's about a half-dozen other computer terminals here, all facing the same way like a classroom. There's posters on the walls with medical information. Everyone in them looks happy and complacent. Zombies. This place is called Sleep Health Centers, just outside of Boston. It's a clinic for people with sleep and disorders. I'm feeling a little loopy from the Zopiclone, so if my writing gets all garbled, just deal with it and I can edit it when I'm clear-headed. The doc wants me to do a little writing. He said that repetition can help with insomnia, and I gotta admit, if things were normal, this room and the clack of these keystrokes would probably make me pass right the fuck out. Things ain't normal though. It's not that I can't sleep, it's that I don't want to sleep. I actually doze off pretty frequently, but then I realize I'm falling asleep and I snap myself out of it. When I don't, when I drift off and can't stop myself, I dream, and that's what I want to avoid. If I could control what I dream about, I would sleep right now and not wake up till fucking October. But I can't control it. And ever since May, ever since Tom. That house on Black Pond Road. Fuck, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. And writing that makes me see it all again in my head. I don't want to relive it. But Dr. Kirsch, he's my doc. Nice guy, smiles a lot, practically whispers when he talks. Dr. Kirsch said that if I write about the experience, it might release me from it. Like there's some sort of mental hold on me, torture on me. Guilt. I was as much a victim as Tom was. Tom was my friend from college. We both attended BU. Freshman year, his room was right across the hall from mine. I remember running into him on a bench late one night when my roommate was spending too long talking on the phone to his girlfriend from home. Tom bummed me a smoke and we just sat and talked about our roommates' idiosyncrasies for a couple hours. After that, we just hung out all the time. Even after college we stuck together. Both got jobs in the city, lived near each other in Somerville. When was it? It was May. Right. Friday the fucking 13th of all days. And Tom called me up after work and said, "What you got going on this weekend?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Any chance you can help me clean out a house?" And I said, "Who you robbing?" And he said, "My dead aunt." And I said, "Friends help you move, good friends help you move bodies." And he said, "Unfortunately somebody already moved the body, but she's got a lot of other shit in her place and I need to clean it out so it can get sold." So he picked me up that night and we drove and listened to tunes on the radio, stopped and ate and chilled and just drove and drove. And I asked him as we were going, "How'd she die?" "She hung herself." "Well, I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't be, she was batshit insane." "I'm sure she loved you, too." "Hardly. But she loved her brother, and he just happened to be my father. He needs to get the house sold but they live out in Washington now, so I agreed to clean the house." "What a good son." "Well, I'm getting paid for it." "Oh, I see. I help do the work and you get all the reward." You get the reward of my company for a weekend in some red hole. I guess that's better than what I had planned. Black Pond Road. That's a hell of a name. Her house looked like it was going to collapse. It was one floor, one large living room connected to a tiny kitchen and two tiny bedrooms. The bathroom was practically a closet. There was a screened porch off the side looking out into woods. It was after 1 in the morning when we got there. I remember suggesting we sleep in the car just in case the house collapsed. Tom pulled out a flashlight, we gathered our bedrolls and backpacks and went inside. The floor moved. It was dark, but when Tom shone his light in, I swore it looked for a moment like the floor moved. Fuck that floor. It was the kitchen. Greasy, stained white tiles. Everything in that room was greasy and stained. Even the windows. They were so gross, the reflected light from Tom's flashlight came back like mustardy puke yellow. Was it clicking? Tapping? I can't describe it, but the feeling when we walked in was like a couple crashers walking into a chatty party and everyone stopping what they were saying and looking at us. Almost the faintest echo of a final sound, like 100 fingernails tapping on a tabletop and then quiet. Did you hear that? I asked. Advertisement. No. We should have slept in the car. My room was like a prison cell attached to the living room. Tom's room was only accessible from the screened porch. I took a look and told him we should switch. If I'm not getting paid, at least give me the nicer room. You don't want this room, this is the room she hung herself in. We just stood there for a bit. The only thing missing from my room are bars on the window. That's so you can escape when her ghost comes for us. A ghost wouldn't be caught dead here? I went and unrolled my sleeping bag on the tiny bed in my room, then climbed in and lay there in the dark. After a while of everything being quiet, I started hearing this sound. It was like chittering. And buzzing. Fucking mosquitoes, that's what I thought. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and tucked it under me to keep anything out. God. If I hadn't been so tired. Something bit me. On the web of skin between my fingers. I woke up and was instantly in pain all over my legs, like 100 needle pricks. And my feet felt like I was standing in the sand at the beach with the water coming in and the mud squishing between my toes. I jerked out of the sleeping bag and fell on the floor. I heard my chin on something, I don't know what. I got up yelling and checking my hand. There was a tiny red dot of a bug bite between my index and middle finger. And then I looked at my legs and they were dotted like a bad case of chicken pox. Hundreds of little bite marks. And I looked at my sleeping bag and bugs. Just skittering out of the bag like. It was a stream of them, crawling over each other. Earwigs. Hundreds of earwigs slithering out of the bag I'd been sleeping in. And house centipedes with them, wiggling along. This just tide of glistening bodies crawling out of the bag with me. I felt like I was going to puke and I ran from the room, slamming the door shut. It was morning. I went out through the porch and into Tom's room and shook him till he made a sound. Get out. You gotta get out of your bag. Dude, what time is it? It's morning time and you need to get out of the fucking sleeping bag, dude. My bag was full of bugs. I'm covered in fucking bug bites. Get the fuck out of the fucking fuck bag. My stomach hurts, just give me a second. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. The top 12 highest educated countries in the world. Board articles. He didn't have any bugs in his fucking bag. I almost hated him for it. But then he complained again about his stomach hurting and pulled up his shirt and I saw these swollen marks all along the waistline of his pants. What the fuck, dude? We're not sleeping in this fucking house, man. Look at my legs. My bites weren't swollen but they itched so bad. I wasn't taking my bedroll home. No way in hell I was keeping it after seeing all those bugs crawl out of it. Burn it. Burn the whole house. Burn it. That's my dream. When I fall asleep, I'm back in that fucking bag, only I can't get out, and the earwigs and the centipedes are covering my feet and my legs and crawling up into my underwear and all over my chest, and then they're on my neck, on my arms, in my ears and wiggling toward my nose, and I can't scream because they'll be in my mouth, and no matter how much I thrash the bag won't open and they just keep crawling back over me. I can't dream that anymore. I spent a week telling myself it was just a dream, but I know they did crawl over me. They had to have been all over me as they slithered into the warm, dark comfort of my bag. Maybe I wouldn't dream it if Tom hadn't. I'm getting off track. We didn't find any bugs in Tom's room. He gave me his car keys and I went into town and bought some cortisone for him to put on the bites. When I got back, Tom was outside. He had his flashlight and was looking under the porch. "Come here." So I went. I looked under the porch at what he was pointing at. The porch was raised on these concrete blocks because of the tilt of the ground, and we could see all the way under the house. On the far side, there was this gray shit. It looked like crusted, packed mud. "That's a hive," Tom said. I remember it felt like I just hit the peak on a roller coaster and now the world was flying down at me. It's huge. There's no way I can do the enormity of this thing justice. It was spread across the underside of the house from the edge of the base on deep into the darkness. Nothing was moving on it, but I looked at it a long time and I could see the little passage holes in it. Hundreds of holes. "We're leaving." No shit, we were leaving. I wanted to be home already. I waited while Tom used the cream I'd bought on his bites, which I knew now were stings. It was unnatural, I swear, the aggressiveness of the insect life in that house. I ended up driving us back. Tom got awful cramps. Awful cramps. He eventually had to lie down in the back seat, doubled over in pain. I pulled over at a rest stop and made him let me check the spots out, but the swelling had gone down. He had these stabbing pains in his gut though. I told him we needed to take him to a doctor. I wanted to see one myself, fucking blights all over my legs. "You gotta tell your parents to burn that fucking house to the ground." "Believe me, I will." Advertisement. I went and had the bites checked on Sunday. I was fine. I had my first nightmare that night. Back in that bag, being consumed by earwigs and centipedes. I called Tom to see if he had gotten checked, but he didn't answer. I called him again on Monday. When I talked to him, he sounded distant. Like he was thinking about something else. I asked if he told his folks about the house and he said he hadn't. I took the day off and went to see him on Wednesday. I buzzed him, but he didn't answer. I got into the building when someone else came out, and found his door was unlocked. He was sitting on his couch, staring at the far wall. He looked gray. His skin, it wasn't pale or rotting or anything, but he did not look healthy. He hadn't cleaned up in a couple days, the place stunk. He just sat there. "Tom, we gotta get you to a doctor, dude." "I'm fine now, thanks." He still sounded distant. I don't think he even saw me. "You're not fine, dude. This isn't fine. I'm getting you some clothes and we're going to the hospital." "Oh God," I let him out of my sight. "This is my fault. I'm so sorry, Tom." When I came back, he was gone. His door was open. I went outside and looked for him, but he wasn't anywhere. I waited for hours on the step to his building. Finally I went home. I went back after work on Thursday, but his door was shut and locked. I buzzed him but got no answer. I called his cell and was directed straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do. I was struggling to think. I'd been having the nightmare for days and had started refusing to sleep. I couldn't think straight. I should have called the police, but when I got home I fell asleep on the couch and dreamed of being trapped in the bag again. I swear, when I woke up it felt like the bites on my legs had returned. Friday. It was a week after that awful day. I was a zombie the whole day. My supervisor told me to go home. I was so tired I missed the stop for Davis Square and found myself wandering out of Alewife, not even thinking about where I was going. The walk helped me think though, and when I got home I called Tom's folks. I told him Tom was sick and I was worried about him. He did sound odd when he called last night. He called you? Did he tell you about the house? Well, I assumed it was a joke. No, sir, you need to have that place raised. Raised? No, he didn't say anything about that. He joked about going to live there. I honestly don't think that was Tom. I don't think he was in control at that point, and whatever was in control intended to take him back to the house to live there. Poor Tom. Poor Tom. I went back to his place that afternoon and got in again. His door was unlocked, but he wasn't there. He had left a note on his fridge. You could tell he was fucked up, it was so hard to read. It said, "I can feel them moving inside me. I can't stop it. I don't want to. Go. Bye." My friend Tom shot himself that weekend. They found his body in Cambridge with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Just a body in an alley with a hole in its head. I didn't even know he owned a gun. The police didn't suspect foul play, but they did an autopsy because he looked like he'd been on drugs. When I called his folks to give them my condolences, I asked them if they'd found drugs. They told me that the coroner had found dozens of large wasp larvae living inside him. Oh God. They had been feeding on him from the inside, burrowing through his body. I told his parents to get that house burned to the ground. I wanted to add that they should piss on the ashes. I wanted to piss on the ashes. I don't know what they did about it. It may still be there, buzzing with life. The floor moved. The house took Tom's life. The bugs. And I can't sleep. I'm trapped in a bag and they're getting in my mouth and my nose and my ears. They're moving across my skin, consuming me. I don't feel better. I just want to forget. How do I post this thing? I can't stand this room anymore. I post this thing. I can't stand this room anymore. I post this thing. I can't stand. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. Prometheus, the Mask of Pandora. In the upper echelons of society there exists an ever-growing group of individuals with entirely too much time on their hands. The members hark from around the world, but share similar traits. Often from lives of exceptional wealth, they are apathetic individuals, detached from day-to-day life and merely looking for the next distraction. In this club they find that something they have been seeking to fill the void. The club allows its members anonymity and encourages pseudonyms taken from ancient gods. Now the name of the game is despair. The members compete against each other, and a recognized hierarchy exists for individuals that have proven proficient in the past. A random person from across the world will be elected and presented to the player, who will then proceed to tear apart the person's life in the most entertaining fashion. The resources of the cabal extend far and wide, and with the significant money at their disposal there are few doors that cannot be unlocked. The game is scored based on the speed with which the player can get the target to dispatch themselves. It's not clear exactly how long the club has been in existence, but the earliest records were shortly after World War II. A small group of English officers returned from the war back to lives of luxury, and started to explore new ways in which hell could be inflicted upon in person. Over the years, the numbers have grown and imaginative characters have brought about the self-inflicted slaughter of thousands. Advertisement. Over the years, rules for the game have had to be implemented. The most egregious examples would be in the late 70s. Ares had just been given his target and had dropped out of sight. The cabal kept the victim under constant surveillance, awaiting what would come next. During a family dinner, Ares calmly walked in and executed 8 members of his family. He tossed a pistol at the poor boy, and instructed that either he shoot himself or the rest of his family would be dead by dawn. Took him 30 seconds to make the choice. Ares loves to brag about the fact that the no-killing rule was brought in to bring him under control. Now the games comprise of identity assassination and the destruction of a person's faith in themselves. One of the more interesting examples was from Isis, who announced from the start that she had no care for the time taken and that this would be her magnus opus. She hired several individuals to undergo plastic surgery to make themselves identical to the target. They started to follow this young introverted woman around, always visible to her in the distance. She began to grow paranoid. At this point, the stalking escalated to several of them following at once and approaching her aggressively. She always ran from these encounters, heading home and locking her doors tight. They would post photos of her taken from her back garden through her letterbox. It took 6 days before she finally snapped and opened up her arms with shards from the mirror. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. The current record is held by Morpheus. It was quite inspired. He paid a number of actors to approach the target, and to say deadpan "wake up, you're in a coma," then act confused when he confronted them about what they had said. He hurled himself from the top floor of his offices before the day was out. Now there is no limitation to who can become a target, save for the members of the club. This extends to celebrities from all walks of life. Many public rag scandals have come from machinations of the club, with the now fading star watching their glamour dissolve in front of their eyes. Those who have lived the high life often cannot continue once they are cast out. Advertisement. An interesting case was with Jupiter. They threw him a bit of a curveball, and elected a target from deep within the Amazon forest. A tribesman with no significant concept of much outside his own village. He kidnapped the man in the night and proceeded to subject him to a Clockwork Orange-style lesson in the horrors and atrocities that have been committed by man. It took 3 days, but he clawed out his own eyes and died from the shock. Now this brings us to you. You have been selected as the next target. My name is Mercury and you are my target. Knowing what you know now, why don't you save us all some time and just swallow the goddamn capsule? Credit to the Silicon Lemming. Everyone knows that kid in school, the one who spends half the school year at home because their immune system can't handle the massive amount of germs and viruses that tend to accumulate in an elementary school. I was the kid. I found myself getting sick every other week. Something in my body was always fighting off illness and fevers were more than common. My doctors didn't know what was causing it. But since it never was serious enough to warrant a hospital trip, they concluded that I got the short end of the stick as far as my immune system went. This did not make my mother's life easy, given that she had recently divorced my father when I started first grade. She needed to be able to go to work, and having a sick child made it very difficult. She reluctantly asked my grandfather for help. They had been estranged for years after a fight, but he agreed to take care of me and took us both in. Moving into my grandfather's house was a new experience that I had never encountered. It greatly outshone the small apartment my mother and father had lived in, a large Victorian home that had been in the family for generations. It stood 3 stories tall and had a large yard behind it, leading into a forest. It had fallen into some disrepair over the years as my grandfather had gotten older, and with no other children to want the house, he'd stopped caring for it. The neighbors had offered him help fixing it up, but he'd rejected them multiple times vehemently, stating that he didn't want people in his business. From what my mother had told me, he'd always been a very cold and unfriendly man, including to her. It didn't change even around me, always feeling as though he would rather be doing anything other than talking to me. That he even took us though made me think that there had to be some good in this man, being an optimistic child. It was shortly after we moved in that my fever started up. My mother had to work and my grandfather was nowhere near as attentive as my mother was, so he left me to my own devices. They were mild, enough to remove me from school. But after a few hours sleeping past when I would have woken to leave for school, I'd get bored with laying in bed and wander. And for a 6-year-old who spent most of their time alone and stuck in a bed, a huge house was the perfect place to explore. My bedroom had been set on the 2nd floor, next to the master bedroom, so I was always near and able to hear my grandfather's snoring. There were multiple bedrooms on the 3rd floor, which made me wonder why my grandfather had bought the house when he'd only lived with my grandmother and mother. My first exploration would be of downstairs though. The kitchen was large and made me wonder how much cooking my grandmother had done when she was still alive. The tiles were chipped in many corners and it was easy for me to hide in the large pantry, thinking that it would be a perfect place to jump out from if someone passed by. Even the oven seemed oversized, darkened with stains from meals past. My grandfather didn't cook much, but he kept a steady supply of basic things to feed myself and my mother. I had never had much of a problem with foods with a few exceptions, which was surprising when you compared most of my classmates who spent most of their days living on chicken nuggets and sandwiches with the crusts cut off and only grape jelly. The living room was a bit bare, the carpet worn down and rough to the touch. An old and torn couch stood in front of a television that barely functioned, looking archaic and rabbit ears bent in multiple directions. The scratches on the couch looked animalistic and I wondered if my grandparents had once owned animals and just never bothered to get it fixed. Outside of a set of dusty coffee tables, a flickering lamp and a grandfather clock that rang out with a distorted chime, nothing else interested me in this room. I didn't imagine that it was used very often. What was used often was the study. It was where my grandfather spent most of his time, looking over books and writing down words and numbers that were impossible for me to comprehend. Even as an adult, I still struggle with the cryptic poems and drawings that seemed to be his entire life's work. He'd taken up most of the wall space with bookshelves and stocked them to the ceiling. The constant smell of pipe tobacco wafted out from this room and hung on his clothing. I learned very quickly not to bother him when he was in there. The look he cast to me when I knocked on the door was one of anger and disdain. When I asked what he was working on, he shooed me out of the room and told me to never go in there again, that it was not a room for children. When the downstairs became boring, I made my way up the stairs and to the third floor. This one was even more empty, nothing but the doors to the bedrooms and a stained bathroom, along with a window that you could see the forest behind the house from. I struggled to see where the forest ended, looking like an endless sea of green and brown, darker as you tried to see further. I checked the bathroom first. Again, everything seemed a bit oversized, but I was a rather small kid, so I wasn't particularly bothered by it. The bathtub made me happy, I could practically swim in it. When I leaned in to look, it was stained dark on the bottom, darker than porcelain normally would be. But with how run down the house was, it seemed to fit. I turned on the water and the water came out reddish-brown before slowly becoming clear. In older houses, the pipes still had a lot of minerals and rust in them, but it still looked a bit unnerving. Seeing the clear comforted my imagination though, especially when the sink did the same thing. I did notice something a bit strange when I opened the cabinet under the sink. Far in the back, behind a few cleaning supplies, was a lone and dirty rubber duck. I found it odd because it didn't seem at all like my grandfather to keep something this childish about, but concluded that it must have been my mother's when she was younger and just abandoned. Feeling a sense of fondness, I took the duck from the cabinet and did my best to wash it off. The poor thing had been left there so long, when the grime came off from him, his yellow body was almost bleached white. His eyes, once black and shiny, looked gray and lifeless. I still liked the little duck though, and decided to take it with me as I explored. The bedrooms disappointed me for the most part, looking long unused. There were 3 altogether. The first was the most barren of the 3, a long faded blue rug half crumpled on the floor and the bare frames of a twin bed in the corner of the room. The wooden slats on the bottom looked cracked and broken, as though someone had stepped on them or jumped violently on the mattress when it was still there. The second had a bit more in it, barren bookshelves with a few thin books far too high for me to reach. Again, another abandoned bed frame sat in the corner of the room, missing its mattress as well and in just the same shape as the other bed. By now, I certainly wondered why my grandfather had multiple beds up here and who used to live in these rooms. In the last bedroom, there was a dresser and eerily enough, a crib. My first thought was that this had been my mother's when she was a baby. It was very small, a change from so much of the oversized objects in the house, just big enough for an infant. Off to the side of the room was what caught my attention. There was a door in the wall, a small square door that I guessed led to the attic. When I tried to pull the door, I found it was stuck closed fairly tightly. I pulled again and once more, but being out of bed and having been wandering up and down stairs had made me tired. I could feel my body begin to ache and decided that it would be an exploration for another day, dragging myself back down to my bedroom and laying down on my bed, falling asleep. The duck that I had kept in my hand stayed on the pillow beside me. Someone had their hand on my head, feeling my forehead. There were whisperings above me, but they didn't sound like my mother or my grandfather. They sounded like kids, people my age. I thought I felt a weight on my chest for a bit. Another hand touched my arm, a small hand. Having had many feverish nights, I thought I was dreaming until I could feel fingernails starting to dig into my arm. The whispers turned to snickers and laughs, something dark. I wanted to open my eyes, but I couldn't. Something had me pressed down and whatever was laying on my chest was pressing to my throat. And suddenly, it was quiet. The hands and whispers were gone. The weight on my throat and chest was gone. I could open my eyes again. When I did, I found the duck sitting on my chest, staring at my bedroom door. It was the evening now and I knew my mother would be getting home. A nightmare, I told myself. A fever dream. I'd had lots of them before, and knew none of them were real. This couldn't have been real. I rubbed my arm where I had felt the nails, not bothering to see if they had been real or not. My mother swooped me up when she came home, looking tired and worried, telling me how much she missed me. My grandfather had barely left the room all day and somewhere in my sleeping, he'd left me a sandwich and juice, not wanting to wake me. My stomach still was in a knot, but seeing them both in the house helped to ease my nerves. Advertisement. I decided the night to take my rubber friend into the bath with me before I went to bed. My mother filled up the bathtub, making a comment of rust in the pipes as the reddish-brown water flowed out and then faded into clear, and helping me in. It felt soothing and watching the little discolored duck float was amusing. It almost seemed to smile, being in use again. Remembering, I asked my mom when she got it. She looked confused at me. I wasn't much for baths myself. I never had a rubber duck. I gave a small low at her and looked back at it. It had been so dirty, it had to have been there from long before. In the middle of my thoughts, I could hear her cell phone ring. "Ah, sorry honey, mommy will be right back," she said apologetically, rushing off to get her cell phone and take the call. Now it was just me and the rubber duck. All alone in the bathtub and not able to see my mother's figure. The walls of the tub seemed higher and larger, almost growing. I felt like I was shrinking and brought the duck to my body, not wanting to lose him in the water that seemed to be expanding around me. I could hear the same noises from my dream earlier, the same snickers and whispers. The thought that I was still dreaming crossed my mind, or that I was getting sicker, but the sounds were getting clearer and clearer. I could make out two voices, a little boy's and a girl's, having a quiet conversation. The third made no sense. It sounded like a baby's gurgle but it was much too distorted and almost sounded like choking. They were getting louder. And closer to me. Until it felt like they were over the side of the tub. I felt as though if I brought my eyes up away from the duck in my hand, I would see them. As a hand touched my shoulder, I could contain my fear no longer and screamed for my mother. Her footsteps stomped to the bathroom and she burst in, frightened and worried for me safety. When I looked up, there was nothing but her in the doorway. No children, no baby. Only me and the duck. I wrapped my arms around her and cried, scared and telling her that someone was there, that someone touched me. She held me and stroked my back, telling me that the fever was making me imagine things, that I was sick and she'd take care of me, make it better. I tried to argue with her, but she told me that crying would make my fever worse and to just breathe, that she was there. She toweled me off and put me to bed, telling me how important it was that I get better, that she loved me and even though it was hard for her to be here, she always would be and if I really needed her, she'd come. I don't know what drove me to, but I brought the rubber duck to bed with me. She didn't seem bothered by it. She even patted its head and said it would be a good dream companion, keep me safe. It may have been my imagination, but when I looked at it before she turned out the light, it almost seemed to smile and its eyes darkened a bit. When my mother turned off the light and left me in the dark, Fear gripped my heart for a bit. I had wondered if those strange whispers and creatures were going to come for me when I went to bed. I had heard them before, I was sure of it. Would they wait for me to sleep? Would they just come in the dark? What were they? Were they human? I couldn't close my eyes. I was too frightened. The noises never came though. I could hear my grandfather's snoring on the other side of my wall and my mother's softer sleeping sighs as well. I couldn't stay awake forever, as hard as I tried. I set the duck on the dresser beside me and bid it good night before falling back to sleep. I heard them again. I was sure of it. Footsteps heading towards my bed. I had awoken before they got to me and could hear them. My breath caught and my hand moved slowly over to my dresser, feeling the rubber of the duck and where its head was turned, facing me. I'm not sure what compelled me to do it, but as a kid, you get some crazy ideas of what might help and protect you. In a moment, I grabbed a toy from my dresser and pointed its gaze to the sound, yelling "Go away!" To my surprise, I heard a pair of tiny shrieks and something move through the open door, small footsteps on the stairs. I panted, holding the toy tight. Someone was there. They were real, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't going to waste any time. I jumped from my bed and dashed into the master bedroom, duck still in my hand. "Mommy, Grandpa, there's something upstairs," I called out, shocking them both and my mother turning on the light. I ran into her arms and buried my face in her chest, telling her of the kids in my room, the talking, that I heard them run up the stairs. My mother tried to calm me down, but my grandfather seemed angry and ripped me from her arms, holding mine and telling me to stop this nonsense and go back to bed, stop telling lies. My mother looked cross at him and told him that I was frightened and should stay with them. He argued that there was no one in this house and I wasn't going to learn to handle myself unless I stopped being coddled. Not wanting to keep an argument going that late at night, my mother got up and said she'd stay in my bed for the night and keep watch over me. Looking irritated, my grandfather grunted and curled back up in bed, telling her to turn off the damn light on her way out. My mother held me all night in my small bed. I think she must have been uncomfortable, but she didn't seem to mind at all. Her warmth was comforting and within minutes, I had fallen back to sleep. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. She did this every night for the next 3 nights, particularly as my fever got worse. The whispers stayed away when she was there, and after the first day, I grew nervous about napping when she wasn't home. It left me worn out and exhausted, aggravating my illness. I felt a heavy throbbing in my ears and the morning of the 4th day, I couldn't hear at all. The doctor had said I had a severe ear infection and needed a lot of rest and antibiotics. It was an unnerving thing, not being able to hear. You take it for granted when you can, all the little things you missed. I wasn't able to hear the tea kettle in the kitchen, nor the creak of the floorboards as I walked up and down the stairs, nor the sound of birds in the forest out behind the backyard. During this time, the duck, who I had named Leonard, never left my side. Whatever those things were, they didn't seem to like him. He seemed to like me though, and as I carried him around, his eyes seemed to get darker and shinier. My fever spiked in the night and I could barely move from my bed. My mother watched over me, worried. She wrote things down on a notepad so I could understand what she was saying. She talked to my grandfather a lot, and even though I couldn't hear, I could tell they were fighting by the looks on their faces. When he left, she looked defeated and wrote something down on the paper. "Mommy will be sleeping in Grandpa's room tonight. You just call if you need anything, okay?" I nodded and she kissed my forehead, the little concerned wrinkle in her brow as she turned off the light. I was so tired, that once she left the door, my eyes closed into sleep. It did not last long though. I realized shortly after I had fallen asleep. I couldn't hear them. I couldn't hear if they were coming into my room or not. My skin tingled and a cold sweat started up in my body. My hands scrambled about my dresser, but somehow, I had dropped the duck from its place beside me. It wasn't there. It wasn't there. Tears began to form in my eyes, thinking that I couldn't hear the creatures that were coming in, that my friend, my only friend, was gone and couldn't protect me. Even calling for my mother wouldn't work, they'd get me before she got there. My blood ran cold as I could feel hands, 2 hands on each arm touch me, hold me down. The pressure returned to my chest. They were here. They were here and there was nothing I could do about it. Tears dripped down the side of my face and something else did. Whatever was on my chest was looking down at me, its head over mine and dripping something thick and cold, putrid smelling. It smelled like the rusted water from the bathtub, but far worse. I could see it staring down at me, small head silhouetted in the darkness by what little light I could see. The ones on the sides were digging their hands into me, and I could feel how slimy their hands were, cold and disgusting. I was sure I was going to die. My throat was being constricted, tiny malformed hands pressing to my neck and choking me. Everything was feeling tighter and tighter around me. The pressure was growing stronger and stronger and their grip on my arms dug into my skin. A feeling of resignation and relief came over me as I began to pass out. A bright light flashed before my eyes, 2 small screams could be heard and all at once, it was all gone. I sat up, gasping for breath and heard something fall to the floor. Quickly, I turned on my light and reached for it. It was Leonard. All his color had returned, but it looked as though someone had tried to burn him, black misshapen patches on his body. He looked happy though. I hugged the small toy to me and cried harder than I ever had before. It woke up my mother. I told her I didn't want to stay here anymore and begged her to go somewhere else, to move, anywhere. She held me close and cried with me and promised me that we'd go somewhere else. Maybe it was the way I was crying or when she saw what looked like dark dried blood on my cheeks and arms, she knew something was deeply wrong. Thankfully, one of my mother's co-workers had the kindness in her heart to take us in. We moved out of my grandfather's house, who barely said a word to us when we left. Walking back inside to his study, I imagined I would not leave Leonard behind. He stayed with me on the move and still stays by my bedside, even as I have long grown into an adult. I did not hear any whispers or feel any more presence in the nights. After that night, my illness is suddenly cleared. I was able to go to school and function as a normal kid. When my grandfather died, I was a teenager in high school. My mother called me and asked if I would help move a few things out of the house, though she did ask rather gingerly. I said that I would. When we returned to the house, close to 10 years after we had left, it was in even worse shape than we had remembered. The windows were coming off the hinges, the roof had rotted and fallen in at places from heavy rains and the plant life was overgrown outside the house. We walked inside and the smell was horrendous, reeking of mildew and the vague scent of death. She cringed and asked me to look for anything that may be saved, otherwise to leave it. I don't think she wanted anything from that house and would have burned it to the ground right then if she could. I walked into the study and the smell of death was stronger than anywhere in the house. The chair where he had sat often was stained with something unmentionable. I imagined that was probably where he had died. A book lay open on his desk and I picked it up. The text was close to illegible, but I could read small words and dates, March 13th and April 2nd. They showed up repeatedly. I glanced through some of his other books and many were just the same, scattered drawings and journals everywhere. I picked up the ones that seemed the most important and left the room, happy to be out of the smell. After disposing of the long-rotted food in the fridge and pantry, I made my way upstairs, a sense of apprehension in my body. I'm not sure what I expected. It looked just the same as when I had briefly lived there 10 years ago. The forest still expanded out into a sea of trees, and even as an adult, I could not see where they ended. Advertisement. I remembered the second bedroom and the books that were on the shelf and went to see if they were still there. Indeed, they were and I reached up for them. They were photo albums and a journal. The photos seemed to go from the most recent to the older. I looked through and found pictures of my mother, going from a teenager to a child, to a toddler. When I got halfway through, I found other pictures that left me confused. They were pictures of children, a boy and a girl. They looked old and worn away, slightly distorted and black around the edges of it. They were mixed up, but the oldest they seemed to be was around 7 years old. In one particular picture, they were standing and waving to the camera with my grandmother in her younger years. She looked to be pregnant. In another picture was the boy in the bathtub smiling up at the camera, holding Leonard. My skin prickled as I stared at the photos. No one had said anything about other children. As far as I had known, my mother was their only child. Why would my grandfather hide this from her, from me, from anyone? I closed the album and put it in the box with the journals, looking at the other book that had been on the shelf. When I opened it, a small envelope fell out. It had never been sealed shut. With a shaking hand, I opened it and pulled out the documents. They were birth and death certificates. The dates stopped 1950 to 1957, 1951 to 1957. Causes of death, drowning. And my grandmother's. 1922 to 1957. Cause of death, suicide. Down in the doctor's notes, it detailed her autopsy. The patient suffered multiple self-inflicted wounds to the stomach and chest. The largest wound was created on the lower abdominal region and ruptured the uterus and small intestine. A brief blood sample and the expanded uterus lead to belief that the woman had been pregnant. Blood and amniotic fluid had been found around the woman's mouth, as well as unknown flesh found in her teeth. No infant body was discovered with her and investigation is still in progress. This was sickening. Was I reading this right? It was saying that my grandmother had killed herself and tried to eat her own child? There was no death certificate for any infant in the bunch. Had they never found it? I looked through the book, searching for anything that would give me a clue about the children, what had really happened. There were places in the book where pages had been torn out. I searched the room desperately and found them having fallen behind the bookshelf. The writing was not my grandfather's, it was far too neat and legible. The first page had the date of March 12, 1957. They're gone. I can even believe it. My babies. He won't even look at me. He thinks I did it. I turned my back for a minute. Just a minute. What a cruel world, to take one so young. He keeps staring at me. Those eyes are burning holes in me, I can't stand it. He's looking at the young one in my stomach. He's thinking I'll drown it too. That man. He won't hold me, won't comfort me, won't shed a tear for them. What if he's right though? The thought of my child coming into this world and losing them. No, I can't let it happen. I can't let them suffer, breathe in this foul air of the world, to be forced into existence just because I wanted another child. How selfish am I? I need to help him. Save him from this world, but I can't bear losing another. What will I do? The second page seemed to be a letter. I was marked with the date of April 2nd. I tried to wipe off the dirt that seemed to be staining the page before I realized what the splotches and stains actually were, long dry blood. My body trembled and I feared what it would say. How long had my grandfather been hiding this? Against my better judgment, I carried on. My darling child. I don't have much time. I held you today, covered in my life and fluids. Cut from my womb. You're crying so quiet, I didn't think you'd be so big, able to cry. I had hoped you'd be small enough to just sleep. Even though you're not ready, you look so beautiful. I made a mistake. Don't worry baby. I'll put you back, then we'll go together. I'll bring you back in my body before we leave this world. Then you won't ever be alone. Mommy loves you so. The letter seemed to cut off there and a trailing pen mark led off the paper, which made me guess that my grandmother had lost consciousness while writing it. My hands were shaking violently and tears had started to form in my eyes. I dreaded the thought of showing this to my mother, finding out her mother was. No. I'd keep this to myself. She didn't need to know. I put the letters back into the envelope and took the album and the book. I'd clear out the album when I got home, give her pictures and burn the others. They somewhat looked like someone had already tried. The last room to inspect was the third bedroom. The roof had collapsed over this one and rotted wood and tiles lay scattered about. The crib that had been there before seemed to be missing. I was about to turn and leave, seeing nothing of value to take, when I remembered and a chill went through my spine. The attic. I had never made it in as a kid. Given what I had found on the bookshelf, I thought of just leaving it be. I didn't want to know. But I knew I had to. With a yell, I yanked open the door, feeling it snap at the top hinge. The smell of dust and dampness seeped out. I could barely see inside, but there was a light bulb hanging inside. My hand searched the side of the wall and found the switch when I crawled inside. What I found made me scream out loud. The crib that had been in the room before had been put in there. The floorboards were stained all over underneath it. Inside the crib, the small mattress was covered with a red and black sludge, looking like it was slowly breathing, gasping for air. It moved, and what looked like a misshapen and contorted face. It opened its mouth at me and let out that same gurgling cry I heard so many years ago. I did not stay any longer. I scrambled out the small door, slammed the attic door shut and grabbed the box, running out of the house faster than I had ever moved. My mother caught me outside and asked what was the matter. I told her that something was living there, something that needed to die, that we needed to get away. She worked to calm me down and got me to the car, driving off as fast as she could to get us back home. I never went back. I never stepped foot in the neighborhood again. My mother told me a few years after that, a storm had caught fire to the roof and the entire thing lit up and collapsed from poor care. I gave my mother the journals and took the photos of the children, my grandmother's entries and the death certificates. I tried to burn them, but they would not catch fire, as hard as I tried, only blackening the edges. The documents and pictures are kept far away in a storage of mine, hidden there to be forgotten and abandoned when I die, or for someone who knew nothing of her or our family to find one day, far off in the future. I do not know or care if that thing is still alive. What I know is that Leonard still remains by my bedside at night. His head is always turned to the door. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but tolerates it. I won't let him turn on the radio at night. I can't take the chance of not hearing the whispers again if they ever do return. He says he doesn't like the silence at night. He doesn't know what the real silence is. Credit to Ariane MD is. Credit to Ariane MD is. Credit to Ariane MD is. Credit to Ariane MD. I suppose when I say Noragakatsu, most of you would guess I was talking about some exotic delicacy, or maybe some holiday resort in the Far East. You'd be dead wrong. A Noragakatsu is a very nasty object that has been part of Japanese folklore for centuries, maybe even millennia. Please keep reading. I know that folklore, especially folklore from a completely foreign culture, bores a lot of people to snores. I can assure you, I'm no fan either. But please believe me when I say that it's essential that you read this and understand what Noragakatsu are and how they work. As best it can be translated, Noragakatsu means devil's jaws in English. According to Japanese tradition, a Noragakatsu is made of two thin boards of wood, one upon the other, that are bound together on one side with either a strip of leather or a length of twine, so that the boards can be opened and closed like a book, or a set of jaws. A certain spell is then written upon the boards to give the object its dark powers. Basically, so long as they knew the magic words, anybody could make one from household objects. Noragakatsu were used to strike a bargain with something they called kafuko unokun, which I'm told means he who pays for his food with good luck. Don't be fooled, though. Even though the name might sound benevolent, kafuko unokun was regarded as a cruel, evil creature and was greatly feared. He was believed to have sway over the forces of luck, and a person could request him to turn a near certain failure in their future into a glorious victory, by writing what they wanted upon a piece of rice paper and placing it inside a Noragakatsu. But there was also a catch. Kafuko unokun would only honor the request if you nominated your payment for his services on the top of the message, and the only payment he would accept was the life of someone you held dear. It had to be someone you truly cared for. Though not necessarily a family member, it could also have been a close friend. If you named someone who you didn't care for, or even someone you actually wanted to die, somehow the Kafuko-unokan would know and the wish wouldn't be granted. But if the Kafuko-unokan approved of the nominated payment, then the person who made the wish would be blessed with the best possible luck in whatever matter they'd asked for the Kafuko-unokan to help them with. After that, the nominated victim would mysteriously disappear almost entirely without a trace. The worst part of the story is that after it had claimed its prize, the Kafuko-unokan would leave a souvenir outside the front door of the person who made the wish. Sometimes it was the victim's bloody clothing, or some other personal effect. But more often than not, it was part of the victim's remains. Some people believe that it did this to traumatize the person who had made the wish, to remind them of the terrible fate they'd placed upon their loved one. Others apparently think that it was more like the Kafuko-unokan leaving a receipt behind for the person who made the wish, acknowledging that it had received its payment and that their business was concluded. Either way, making a norogakatsu and striking a bargain with Kafuko-unokan were forbidden practices in Japan, punishable by death. So once the deal was done, the person who had committed the crime would usually destroy all the evidence, the norogakatsu, and whatever traces of the victim had been left upon their doorstep. Even if you are into old monster legends, I'm sure you're probably just reading this and thinking that it's just some old superstitious hokum. Well, a few days, hell, probably even a few hours ago I would have agreed with you. But not anymore. I can't tell you too much about who I am or how I know what I know. What I can tell you is that I have connections in the missing person turned homicide investigation of a teenage boy somewhere in the Midwest. About a year ago, in the lead up to Halloween, there was this meme going around with a picture showing the top of a skeleton, the skull, neck and shoulder blades. People would forward it on with MMSs, tweets and the like with simple messages like Happy Halloween, or Boo, etc. You might have gotten one yourself. Eventually, the meme found its way to somebody with a bit of knowledge about anatomy and they realized that the skeleton in the picture was awfully realistic. They reported it to law enforcement. But it would be weeks before the report made it through the bureaucracy to a medical examiner who verified that the image did indeed warrant some investigation. The ME was convinced that the skeleton was indeed a genuine article, but of particular concern to her was the pinkish tone of the bones, and the trace amounts of what appeared to be blood and flesh still on it. What also concerned her were a series of scrape marks that could be seen on the bones when the photo was examined at high resolution. They appeared to encompass the entire skull and the ME's opinion was that these were made when the flesh was stripped off the body, by something with very sharp and very hard teeth. There seemed to be no legitimate reason for a photo like this to be circulating among the public. Law enforcement determined that it was either a leaked crime scene photo, or evidence to an as yet undiscovered crime. They considered that the photo might have been taken by some callous private citizens, read asshole kids, who'd found a dead body, photographed it, published it online, and never reported it to the cops. Even more disturbing was the possibility that the photo was published by the psycho who had done this and wanted the world to admire his handiwork. The trouble was that we had only one photo to go on, which made it really hard to determine whether or not the photo was even related to an active or solved case. The EXIF data, the data buried within the JPEG file that detail where the photo had come from, what camera had taken it, when it had been taken, etc., had all been wiped clean, which isn't hard to do if you know what you're doing. All we had to go on was the photo itself. I won't bore you with the technical details, but suffice to say that the computer forensics techs made a thorough sweep of the National Crime Scene Photo Database and determined that the photo didn't pertain to any case in the digital archives. Advertisement. Several other analyses were run on the photo, but the one that paid off was the facial reconstruction simulation, a piece of software that scans the photo of the skull and determines what the guy would have looked like when he was still alive. Eventually, we were able to match the reconstructed face to an active case file out of state. The skull belonged to a teenage boy, let's call him Jack, who had been reported missing. While the photo itself was being investigated, the meme was also being examined. We were charting its course back from the concerned citizen who initially reported the image to the police, to the first person who'd ever sent the image. It wasn't easy as the meme leapfrogged back and forth across several popular messaging services along its way. Just over a week after the victim's identity was confirmed, we were able to determine who had started the meme. We'll call her Jill. What was of immediate interest to law enforcement was that Jill's name was already on record in Jack's case file. She was apparently a school friend of his and one of the last people to see him alive. A warrant was issued for Jill's cell phone and she was brought in for questioning. The phone was thoroughly analyzed and an MMS was recovered containing the skeleton photo. But while the phone had a definite record of receiving the message, it was later discovered that Jill's service provider had no record of ever transmitting it to her. Another weird thing was that the sender ID for the MMS didn't contain any numbers, it contained only Unicode Japanese kanji characters. This is technically impossible. The way the system is set up, the phone should only be able to log a series of numeric digits into the sender ID field. The characters in the sender ID spelt out Nintano shitalk. This isn't someone's name. The text translated it and discovered that it roughly means your employee, or your business partner. Under interrogation, Jill recalled receiving the MMS. She said that the message kind of creeped her out, especially because it came from an unknown sender, which is what the messaging software told her, because it wasn't able to interpret the invalid sender ID. But because it was close to Halloween, she assumed that one of her friends sent it as a seasonal thing and so she forwarded the cool, creepy photo on, starting the meme. According to the MMS's timestamp, she received it only a few hours after Jack was last seen. But Jill claimed she never linked the message to Jack's disappearance in her mind because at the time she received the MMS, she didn't even know Jack was missing. The detectives grilled Jill for over 3 hours, but when she began to get really upset, her father ended the interview and without harder evidence, the detectives couldn't hold her. The tech who analyzed the phone. Well, let's just say that he's very thorough at his job, and he didn't give up on the mystery of how this phone could have received an impossible MMS, that its service provider had no record of ever sending. He dug deep into its software, looking for his explanation. Eventually, he came upon a curious anomaly embedded in the phone's firmware, more Unicode Japanese characters, this time a long block of them. The firmware is supposed to be just a universal machine code that tells the phone how to work. Japanese text, or text in any human language for that matter, doesn't belong in there. But as intriguing as this discovery was, it still didn't explain the impossible MMS. At least, that's what we thought at the time. You see, the Japanese text was garbage data which means it was worked into the firmware in such a way that it had no actual effect on how it worked. It was on the phone, but it wasn't doing anything. By this point, I was involved in the investigation. When I learned about the Japanese text in the firmware I got curious, so I ran it through Google Translate. It didn't translate well, though. A quarter of the words weren't even recognized and the ones that were didn't make any sense together. Frustrated, I called upon a Japanese-American acquaintance to translate for me. I'd expected it to be the manufacturer's copyright on the firmware code, or perhaps even the programmer signing his work. But it actually turned out to sound more like a somber poem of sorts. My Japanese-American friend agreed, saying that the language was far more elegant than day-to-day Japanese and more than a little archaic. Seeking answers, we phoned up the phone manufacturer's development lab in Japan. We eventually got through to the manager of the team who developed the phone software and, with my friend acting as translator, we asked him about the mysterious text in the firmware, and also if he had any explanation as to how a Japanese phrase could be recorded as the sender ID for an MMS on one of their phones. He very politely denied knowing anything about either of these matters and assured me that any garbage data in the firmware was of no consequence. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. Still wanting answers to at least one of the mysteries, I phoned a professor of Japanese literature at Tokyo University to see if he could recognize the verse in the firmware. Before my colleague could finish reciting the verse, the professor cut him off. He recognized it, all right. Despite the language barrier between us, I could hear the discomfort in the man's voice as he explained that the verse was the incantation written upon Norogakatsu to give them their dark powers. It was at this point that my colleague explained the Norogakatsu legend of his culture to me. He knew the story well, he just had never heard the actual incantation used to create one, until now. While this was all quite educational, it really didn't get us anywhere in terms of the investigation. But I kept thinking about the problem of the MMS, and eventually I had this crazy thought: the fact that Jill had received a photo of Jack's remains was eerily similar to the part of the Norogakatsu legend where the monster would leave behind some proof of his victim's death. I suppose just for fun, I skimmed through the rest of the case notes to see if there were any other parallels between the murder and the Japanese legend. I almost wish I hadn't. When I read through Gill's original witness statement, the one taken when police were just investigating Jack's disappearance as a missing persons case, she remarked that she remembered the last day she saw him clearly, because it was the same day her history teacher had returned a test that she'd surprisingly aced, even though she'd thought she was sure to flunk it. My stomach sank when I read that statement. Because I was quite familiar with the contents of Gill's phone, and I remembered reading about this history test before. About 3 days before Jack's disappearance, Jill had typed a text message into her phone: "I need to pass this history test." Jack's name was marked at the top of the message, as the intended recipient. The similarities between the old stories I'd been hearing and the murder were suddenly clear as day. Jill had a phone that for some reason contained an old Japanese spell used to summon a monster. She typed what could be interpreted as a demand for a good history mark into the phone, with her close friend's name on the message. And just like in the stories, Jill aced her test. Jack disappeared without trace, and Jill received a sick memento of his death. If you'd pointed this out to me at the time, I would have chuckled and said, "Yes, it is a weird coincidence, isn't it?" I wanted to believe that that was all it was. I really did. But deep down, in that hidden doubting Thomas part we all have that doesn't completely trust modern rationality to be our salvation, I was frightened. Then, a couple days ago, which was about a week after I'd called the phone manufacturer, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Osaka, Japan. Inside were a heap of papers. On top of the stack was a cover letter explaining what the package contained. It was written in bad English, although I was able to get the gist of what it was saying. The sender didn't identify themselves, but it's clear that they must work for the manufacturer of Jill's phone and that they were aware that I'd been asking questions about the hidden text in the firmware. Advertisement. My informant was part of the development of the phone series that Gill's phone belonged to, and he or she had an explanation for how the Norogakatsu incantation had gotten into the phone's firmware. There was a guy on the development team, smart, but a real emo loner type. Not the shy kind of loner, the crazed gunman in the making kind. People would try to be friendly and reach out to him and he'd stare daggers at them. For whatever reasons, the guy had issues. Shortly before the phone series went into production, the guy hung himself. My informant believes that before he died, the guy implanted the hazardous spell onto the phones as his ultimate screw you to the world. Within a few months of the phone's release, somehow the company's executives got wind that there was a problem with them receiving disturbing MMSs that the phones seemed to be generating themselves. The company began to investigate the problem quietly themselves, secretly querying all their active phones remotely. They found scores of incidents where a phone had a record of an incoming MMS from an Atano Shita, your business partner, containing a single JPEG file. Most people who had received these messages had subsequently deleted them. But in several dozen cases, the JPEGs were still on the recipient's phones and were retrieved by the company. An upgraded version of the firmware, with the incantation removed, was developed, but ultimately never implemented because it was discovered that the phones kept rejecting it. The guy who put the incantation into the firmware had also rigged it so that it would never allow itself to be overwritten. 2 months before Jack's disappearance, the company abruptly terminated their investigation. By this time, They were aware of nearly 800 instances of MMSs being received from an Nosleep. An unspoken agreement was made that the problem was unsolvable and that their best course of action was to simply turn a blind eye. Everyone involved in the informal investigation was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Orders were issued to destroy all the records. But my anonymous contact managed to keep copies of most of them, which he or she has sent to me. It's taking me a while to get through the documents he or she sent me, as most of them are written in Japanese. But luckily their list of the phones that received an Nosleep message was written in regular digits. I ran all the American numbers on that list through our database, and all of them, every single one, belongs to somebody who was questioned in relation to a missing person case that began within days of them receiving that message. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that my contact also sent me printouts of all the JPEGs they could salvage that turned up during the manufacturer's investigation. They are all just like the photo of Jack's remains that began this entire case, a realistic skeleton grinning into the camera, covered in the scrape marks left by whatever sharp-toothed nightmare stripped them of all of their flesh. I don't have access to the advanced software that synthesized an accurate face for Jack's skull. At least, not the kind of access that allows me to use it without answering a lot of difficult questions first. But I scanned the photos and overlaid them with Photoshop onto the case photos of the missing person associated with their recipient. I admit I'm no expert, but as far as I can tell, every one of those skulls fits perfectly inside the face of one of those missing people. I can't tell you the name of the manufacturer involved, nor the name of the phone series. Suffice to say, they're a well-known company and the phone series is quite popular. I wish I could tell you more, but if I do, I have no doubt that the company will have this warning suppressed as defamation, and that can't happen. The word has to get out, and I figure that half a warning is better than no warning at all. There's a common series of phone out there with an evil curse marked inside them. You may well be carrying a Norogakatsu in your purse, or pocket. And even if you aren't, someone who cares about you may be. So please, be wary of typing out what you wish for, or hope for, or even think you need. But most of all, be especially careful of whose name you place on those messages. Because you just may be sending them into the devil's jaws. Spread the word. Credit to Dark Me. Spread the word. Credit to Dark Me. Spread the word. Credit to Dark. It was All Hallows Eve as the old ones called it, but to us it was simply Halloween. A time for darkened skies, for fallen leaves golden and brown in the feet of children kicking with verve through them, for sweets and treats, for frightening films and spooky tales, for friendship, for the fear and love of the unknown, and for wide grinning turnip heads glowing in the clouded night. And costumes, yes, costumes. Some dressed as comical characters, superheroes, and popular toys, others following the traditions of old, dressed as the dead and embracing the macabre delight of it all. Most kids had Christmas, which I loved too, but for us Halloween was the most important night of the year. That one time where we could truly be what we dreamed, falling into characters, creatures, and people far removed from the fragility of our childhood selves. Stuart was an undead pirate who had risen up from his watery grave, and if we didn't take part in some looting and pillaging we'd surely have found ourselves walking the plank. Andy was a Terminator, complete with leather jacket, a metallic sheet created with tin foil, slicked back hair and sunglasses which hid a glowing red left eye behind. I was Van Helsing, armed to the teeth with wooden stakes, crosses, garlic and a vial of water I assumed was holy because I had filled it from a tap in the local church's bathroom. Even back then my mind was permanently stuck in the hokey sets and thick smoke of the old Hammer horror Dracula films. Mac, he was dressed as an injured football hooligan complete with torn football strip, blooded and bandaged head, and his arm in a sling, all the more ironic as he would in fact grow up to be a footballer. The other Andy, who we affectionately called Squire, was decked in luminous skeleton bones, and with his wiry frame, and hooded skull mask, put the fear of God into quite a few of the younger kids in the neighborhood. We were 12 years old at the time, and while none of us had openly spoke of it, We seemed to sense that it would be our last year gazing - a word which in itself would soon be replaced by the now deep-rooted trick or treat. I remember feeling a sadness in the pit of my stomach as my parents helped me prepare my costume. The others seemed a little more reluctant to go out that Halloween, and by the following year their delight for the entire celebration would be diminished for many subsequent years, and who could blame them? I just wasn't ready to say goodbye to those fun-filled happy nights, wandering the leaf-covered streets of my local neighborhood laughing with my friends, carrying bags of sweets and chocolate and toffee apples accumulated from our Halloween rounds. It's rare that you recognize something is coming to its end, mourning for it before it has slipped away. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when we first stepped out into the street, and the winter sky blackened everything from above, the stars snuffed out by a thick shroud of cloud. My house was always the meeting point on those glorious nights, as my parents loved to decorate the house with spider webs, hanging skeletons, and mean-looking banners depicting vampires, ghouls, and witches fermenting a strange brew, not to mention all of the food. They both seemed to revel in the entire ceremony of the night, more so than anyone else I knew, and they had done since whenever I could remember for both me and my older brother, who now helped out rather than went out. Such wonderful nights as my friends arrived and we all bobbed for apples, or dropped forks from between our teeth into a bucket of water filled with fruit, hoping to skewer one to win a prize. There we were on the street curb, looking up the hill towards King's Drift and the web of streets we were going to explore in search of treats. In some cases we'd even be given money if the homeowners didn't have any food, or had ran out. In more recent times the jack-o'-lantern has become popular, with myself always carving a few pumpkins with ghoulish faces for the local kids, and their parents, who always frequent our haunted house with its smoke machines, screaming skulls, and mountains of sweets. That night, however, I carried a tumshi hide, to light the way. Essentially a carved-out turnip with a candle inside and a horrible face glowing outward, lighting the way, a far greater and malignant sight than any pumpkin. Holding the lantern by a thick piece of string, which my dad had attached to the side of its face with 2 nails, we headed out to enjoy our last night of gazing. The streets were abuzz with kids, most of them a bit younger than ourselves, accompanied by their parents or older siblings, which only made me realize how close to the end of our Halloween night we really were. I believe it was the first time that I ever felt old, no matter how preposterous such a thought appears at only 12 years of age. Most houses opened their doors gladly, occasionally you would see a light going off as we approached signaling that the people inside didn't want to be disturbed, but damn it we knocked and banged their doors anyway. This was our night, and the grown-ups who were too stingy to take part should have known better. After an hour we had covered 3 streets, each time the same social pleasantries taking place. We'd enter the house, slightly cautious at first of being in a stranger's darkened home, but the thought of 5 of us being together banished those worries soon enough. Each of us would then be asked to tell a joke or a riddle, and in return for the entertainment we would be rewarded with sweets and chocolate. Of course Andy would try to push the envelope a little more than the rest of us and on a few occasions delved into what could only be described as adult humor. The grimaces on the faces of those listening were plain to see. Advertisement. As we passed the other children in their costumes, some great, some thrown together at the last moment, we joked and laughed and celebrated at the growing collection of food and money in our bags. Yes, even if it was going to be the last year, it was surely to be the best of hauls. As we ran through the darkened streets, lit only by the occasional spot and splash of orange hue from the lights above, it seemed as though the unspoken finality of it, the end of those nights, those years of being what we wanted to be, of being kids, of not caring about how we were seen, that it all added to the potency of the experience. We ran faster. We giggled and laughed and took shortcuts through gardens and places we were never supposed to tread. We lived and felt alive on the night of the dead. Squire's watch went off at 10 p.m. and we knew it was time to call it a night. We walked back towards my house where each year we would sit with my parents and some of my neighbors, drinking fizzy juice and stuffing our faces with the chocolate and sweets which we had been given by the bucket load. But our steps were slower than usual on the journey home. Our jokes less loud, our grins less wide, and as the lantern gasped its last as we reached the gate to my garden, it was as if we sighed together, knowing that something precious was soon to be lost forever. As we piled into my house and were greeted by the happy smiles of my parents, they too appeared to sense that things were changing, as if part of their lives would never quite be the same. I think it is hardest for parents when their youngest child reaches those thresholds, those closed chapters of their childhood, never to be opened again, knowing that they too cannot live those wonderful nights in quite the same way either. Me, Andy, Stuart, Mac, and Squire sat in a circle on the living room floor as an old horror film played in the background. We each in turn emptied our bags, assessing the loot. It was indeed a good year, and the sheer mass of sweets was sure to last us all for one stomach-turning, sugar-overdosing week. Chocolate bars, crisps, boiled sweets, jelly babies, strawberry laces, toffee apples, and all manner of other treats were quickly separated from the useless bulk fillings of monkey nuts and other fruit. Only the good stuff, only the good. Bite the Bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Bored articles. We joked and laughed once more, and in that cozy house we played the parts of kids again, dressed up in costumes, telling spooky stories, and for a moment it felt as though nothing would ever change, that it would always be like that, together as friends, young, hopeful, and courageous, until I asked, almost automatically, what we would all be dressing up as the following year. The question was never answered, and it didn't need to be. It was then that I noticed Andy had stopped talking and hadn't interjected with his usual jokes for at least 2 minutes, surely a record. No, he was staring at something. We asked if he was okay, but he wouldn't respond, his gaze fixed, glazed over as if he were still wearing his costume sunglasses. We followed the route of that stare, and our eyes and our heads dropped almost in unison, falling upon the source of our friend's peculiar silence. Andy was looking at my pile of sweets which sat in front of me. My heart began to thud helplessly as I finally realized what had left the most talkative of my friends speechless. Poking out from that pile of chocolates, crisps, and lollipops was a bloodied and severed finger. Advertisement. I can't remember who screamed first. It was probably me, as my cool and calm Van Helsing soon melted away, revealing the shocked and fragile 12-year-old boy at his core. All I know is that my parents called the police, and within half an hour each of us, the undead pirate, the vampire hunter, the luminous skeleton, the football hooligan, and the killer robot from the future, were being questioned about the strange finger sitting amongst my sweets. We were asked to try and remember which houses we had visited, but we had been to so many, had been so fervent in our need to make the most of that last Halloween night, that we simply could not remember all of them. Soon, several police cars showed up with red and blue and white lighting up the now lifeless, costume-less street outside, and without wasting a moment they began walking the neighborhood with us and our parents, that place now torn from its disguise, moving swiftly from door to door, trying to find out where the finger had come from. Which one of those welcoming, friendly houses with smiling owners, warm fires, carved grinning turnips and buckets of sweets, had taken us into their dimly lit home and given to a child the most horrific of gifts. But it was all in vain. No one claimed ownership. There was no record of anyone at the local hospital losing a finger that night, not one shred of evidence. Just normal people concerned about the strange discovery we had made and what it might mean. Perhaps it had been an accident, perhaps it had been cut off in some sort of bizarre mishap, as I had heard of people storing a severed finger in the freezer so that it might be reattached. Maybe it got mixed up with the food somehow, but even at that age I realized how unlikely and ridiculous such a proposal would be. That was indeed the last night we went geyser, and, in more ways than one, my friends simply did not have the stomach for the childhood charade of let's pretend any longer. Even I did not wish to go out the following year, but for me it wasn't about being too old for it all. I still loved Halloween, and do to this day. It wasn't about outgrowing it, and it wasn't even about that horrible finger which had been placed silently into my treat bag. No, it wasn't that either. What really stopped me from knocking on strangers' doors and asking for some treats, was the bloody thumb and 3 fingers carefully placed in the other boys' bags. Credit to Michael Whitehouse X. Credit to Michael Whitehouse X.